And if we're going to talk about Kennedy and international relations, we got to talk about Cuba and we got to talk about Fidel Castro. So, when Fidel Castro overthrows the regime that was before him, at first we want to be friends, but it becomes pretty clear pretty quick he is definitely more interested in being friends with the USSR. And when that becomes clear, we decide we do not want to be buddy-buddy with Castro, and that's how a lot of Cubans feel. They don't really want this whole communist thing, and a lot of them flee to the United States. And if you've ever been to Miami or to Key West, you know they have a lot of Cuban influence, and that's because that's where a lot of people are going to immigrate to. So Kennedy is basically going to use this new loyalty of these new Cuban Americans to try to get back at Castro. So we basically go to these new Cuban Americans and we're like, don't you love being American? How would you like your other friends to experience democracy in America? We're going to invade Cuba. Would you like to help us? A lot of them say, yeah, we're in. And this is when the Bay of Pigs happens. And basically, they use these new Cuban Americans to invade Cuba, but it's a total disaster because Kennedy provides no umbrella cover. If you remember them talking about that in the assassination video, basically, the US does not have these Cuban exiles' backs, and so a lot of them get killed, and it's basically a huge political and international relations disaster because we basically send them in without much help. So that's gonna blow up in Kennedy's face a little bit. Next issue with Cuba is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So basically, in 1962, Kennedy gets informed that Nikita Khrushchev and the USSR are building nuclear missiles in Cuba. And we knew we had weapons in the USSR before, but it's concerning when it's in Cuba because of the proximity. So now, basically, the whole East Coast is within nuclear missile range in a matter of minutes, which is pretty concerning. So Kennedy does not mess around with his feelings about this. On TV, he calls out Khrushchev and says what he's doing is a reckless and provocative threat to world peace. So after 6 pretty intense days where we thought we might actually go to nuclear war, Khrushchev finally backs down and says he's going to remove his missiles. And on the outside, the U.S. puts up the front like we were the ones that strong-armed the USSR into submission. But in actuality, behind the scenes, Kennedy was also agreeing to remove missiles in Turkey and Italy in exchange for Khrushchev removing his missiles. After this, as we'll see, they're still not quite friends, but they install a hotline so that they can communicate directly from Moscow to Washington and avoid issues because of lack of communication ever again. They're both also going to sign what is called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which basically is going to ban above ground nuclear testing, just as it says. So they sign it, and a bunch of other countries sign it, but as we know at this time, the US and the USSR are the ones we're truly concerned about with nuclear weapons. Oh, but oh no, Mom and Dad are fighting again, but this time it is over Berlin. So at this time, poor West Berlin is still totally surrounded by East Germany, and Khrushchev finds it pretty intolerable that the First World isn't going to back down and just hand West Berlin over. Kennedy responds with, "It's not me, it's you, USSR, that's causing all of these problems. Says if you want war and if you want conflict, it's you that's causing it, not us." And Khrushchev responds to that by saying, you know what? I'm going to build a wall. And so Khrushchev builds a wall, the Berlin Wall to be specific, and basically we table the Germany issue for later times. And what we're going to focus on instead is what you've all been waiting for, Vietnam. Remember, y'all, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. We have a nice little rhyming couplet here with the French being in Indochina, versus the US in the American Revolution. So basically, at this time, the French have colonized Indochina. It's called French Indochina at this time. And they're basically doing the same dealio that the British was doing to the American colonists, where they're taxing and taking resources from the people in Indochina without them having any representation or any voice in the matter. And we can kind of tell from history the way that makes people feel. So, our nice little George Washington parallel, or any of the founding father parallels in this situation, is going to be a guy of the name of Ho Chi Minh. Basically, Ho Chi Minh travels around, gathers some ideas and some thoughts, and he says, "Give me liberty." But instead of "give me liberty," he says, "Give me communism." And he thinks that communism is actually going to be the answer to all of the problems in Vietnam. So this is going to put Truman, yes, we are back to Truman, we have gone back in time, in a tough spot. Because the US, and especially Truman, is not for colonization. It's kind of our thing. But also, we're not against communism. So he doesn't really know what to do here. Are we going to support the French and say that we support colonization? Or are we going to allow Vietnam to do their thing and say we support communism? And at the end of the day, we all know the US will never choose communism. And so the US decides to put their aid and their money towards helping the French keep Vietnam anything but communist. Uh-oh, here it is again. It's domino theory. Except this time we're talking about Southeast Asia. But this is important because we're kind of going to have a similar situation as we did in Korea, where people are like, what is this place? Why do we care? And we care because we believe at this time if Vietnam becomes communist, pretty much the rest of Southeast Asia, maybe potentially Australia, are also going to follow suit. So in 1954, the French get booted the heck out of Vietnam, and once again, history is rhyming. And we signed these things called the Geneva Accords, and they split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The north part becomes communist, the south part is anti-communist. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it's the same thing that happens to Korea. Also in 1954, the US and a couple other countries signed SEATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's basically NATO, but for Southeast Asia. So all of these Southeast Asian countries are making an agreement to not be communist, and to also limit the spread of communism. Alrighty, let's set up the sides of the Vietnam War. So in the South, we have Ngo Dinh Diem, who is leading the nationalist, anti-communist part of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam. And then in the north, you're going to have Ho Chi Minh leading the communist side. And his organization is going to be called the National Liberation Front, or they're also called the Viet Cong. That's what their guerrilla fighters for the NLF are called. So conflict is going to start happening when the Viet Cong under Ho Chi Minh are going to invade the southern part of Vietnam to try to take over. To make matters worse, Ngo Dinh Diem is very anti-Buddhist, which is the majority of the population in Vietnam in terms of religion at the time. And that's where this famous image of a Buddhist self-immolating, which means setting oneself on fire in a form of protest, comes from, because he enforces a bunch of anti-Buddhist policies. And that's obviously going to lose him a ton of support, so he becomes even more unpopular than he already is. Originally, the US and Kennedy want to support the leader of South Vietnam, but when it becomes clear that he's going to continue to be unpopular in South Vietnam and isn't ever really going to win that support, we actually decide to support an insurgency in South Vietnam to overthrow him. So Ngo Dinh Diem gets assassinated, and then Kennedy gets assassinated just 3 weeks after that. So Lyndon B. Johnson is the man in power now. And LBJ has a pretty firm interventionist and anti-communist policy that he's going to take to Congress. So most of Congress isn't really probed to take action in Vietnam until the USS Maddox, which is a U.S. ship, is in the Gulf of Tonkin. It gets fired at by the Vietnamese, and Lyndon B. Johnson uses this to his advantage, goes to Congress, and gets them to sign what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It's a pretty big power move because he basically gets every senator except for two to sign something that says, hey, do what you need to do in this time. So all of a sudden, we find ourselves in history. The president has tremendous war powers, and now we're involved in a war in a country that most people don't even know how to place on the map. So we're kind of wondering, how did we get here, and should we even be here? And that is a thought we will carry on into the next section of the reading.